They wanted to know, just as the staff at the Center for Family Research wanted to know, how are you going to be able to protect the information that you're going to collect from me? And finally, people in the community wanted to know, how is this going to benefit our community? Why should we do this with our community? And that sponsored the development of a protocol that was designed with the community and with the staff at the Center for Family Research for collecting DNA from community members. So we developed this pamphlet, and this pamphlet was the first contact people or prospective participants had with this DNA collection effort. And what we did is we translated questions that the community had directed at us into print so it could be talked about. So we answered questions like, why collect information about genes? What does this have to do with me as an African American? What will I be asked to do? What will be done with the DNA sample? Will my genetic information be available to anyone? What are the benefits to me and my family, and will I get paid extra for doing this? And I'm happy to say that thus far, our ability to collect DNA from saliva is hovering around 90%, and we've had a grant funded where we're doing something that I'm not sure I would do actually. We are going out and collecting blood so we could assay DNA from blood and do other more sophisticated analyses, and those rates are running at greater than 90%. So our communication systems, working with the community has really paid off. There's a lot of trust there, and so far so good. So we began what we call our Gene by Environment initiative, focusing on one gene. And this is a gene that many of you will know. It's a well-characterized polymorphism. It's called 5-HTT, and it comes in two variants, a short allele and a long allele. And depending upon how those are paired up, it can have some implications for mental health and for behavior. The short alleles, if you have one or two copies of the short allele, it's associated with lower serotonin transporter availability, and you've heard about that in terms of its linkage with depression. There's also literature which links having one or two copies of this short allele with alcohol and heroin dependence in adulthood, but I have to tell you, and this is one thing I've learned over the past 5 years, if you look carefully, and this is so important, if you look carefully at the effect sizes in the direct linkage studies, they are very small. And all of us, and maybe this isn't true for you, but it was true for me, I started to develop the idea when all of the news about the human genome came out that biology was destiny. That is not true. And I would encourage all of you, if you get a chance, I know you have better things to do in your spare time, but look at some of the genetic linkage studies which link having a risk allele with a mental health outcome or with an antisocial behavior outcome or a substance use outcome. These linkages are tiny, and we must not accept these things on face values. We must go to the literature. And so I have listed here that 1 or 2 copies of the short allele is linked with alcohol and heroin dependence. Oh my gosh, that effect size is so small. And if actually you get better effect sizes, if you look at having 1 or 2 copies of the short allele with non-dependent samples. There's studies of college students where if they have 1 or 2 copies of the short allele, they drink a lot more. There's a large community study in England. People who have 1 or 2 copies of the short allele, you know, the rates of drinking and substance use is a lot greater. But that's all to say we all must be careful and we all must be vigilant about these things. Of particular interest, having 1 or 2 copies of this short allele is linked to a proximal risk factor for adults and children, particularly for substance use. For kids, 1 or 2 copies is linked to having a slightly higher activity level, a shorter attention span, and on a dimension of positive to negative mood, having a tendency to have a more negative mood. In adults, adults tend to be a little more impulsive, show a little bit more negative affectivity, and they tend to disregard rules a little bit more. That's why we chose to focus on this. There's a lot known about this particular gene, and it's been well characterized. So we wanted to test a jugular hypothesis for us. We have spent 15 years identifying parenting processes that rural African American caregivers use that forecast positive developmental trajectories and are protective against substance use and behavior problems. So we wanted to test 2 hypotheses. The first hypothesis was that if an early adolescent had 1 or 2 copies of the short allele of 5-HTT-LPR, that would forecast over 4 years increases in substance use. And no one had really looked at these things in terms of longitudinal assessments. Most assessments linking genes with behavior are contemporaneous analyses. So we wanted to see developmentally if there's a link. And our jugular hypothesis was whether competence promoting parenting, which we defined as parents providing their youth with high levels of instrumental and social support, being very responsive, providing them with racial socialization, which included imparting strategies for dealing with racial discrimination, whether that would moderate or condition a link between 5-HTT-LPR and increases in youth substance use. Now, the reason that we used racial socialization as one of the predictors is that in our longitudinal epidemiologic research, we find that one of the strongest predictors of rural African American youth increasing their substance use was exposure and the experience of racial discrimination. So in this first study, from the counties that I showed you on the map, we had a sample of 298 rural African American youth. They were 11 at wave 1, and we obtained data from them when they were 11, 12, 13, and 14. In this sample, 41% lived at or below poverty. And we collect all of our data in the homes of participants. So trained staff, trained rural or trained African American data collectors travel into the community, collect data on laptop computers from caregivers and parents, bring that data back, and then it's dumped on a mainframe where it can be used for analysis. In this particular data collection, the youth reported on